this episode, I spoke to Dr. Diego Battiston from the University of Edinburgh. We spoke about his research on the impact executions have on crime rates. You can expect to hear about topics like how important the effect of media publication is on impact executions have on crime rates, among other things. And I really hope you enjoyed the video. So could you summarize your findings, what your research is about, and how it's different from other research papers?
Sure. Okay. So death penalty is a very controversial policy, as you may know. There are two dimensions in this debate, in this controversy. One dimension is related to ethical and moral aspects, which I think that are very important, but that we can't contrast. We can't study with data. And the second dimension is more related to practical facts. And this is where empirical researchers can make a contribution. Specifically, a question in the second dimension that has concentrated a large part of the debate is whether death penalty can deter or can prevent serious crimes like murders, rapes, etc. So there is a first generation of earlier studies in the past that compare states with and without death penalty in the United States and try to infer that differences in crime are due to death penalty, differences in serious crimes. But of course, this is a very bad idea because these states differ in many other dimensions. And so differences in serious crime can be due to virtually any reason, right? Then there is a second generation of studies about death penalty that exploited the fact that, you know, in some states, and usually due to court decisions, death penalty is sometimes suspended for some years, then it may resume, then it is suspended again, no, etc. So you can essentially compare crime levels during periods when death penalty is on versus periods when death penalty is off. And you can even compare this difference with the behavior of serious crimes in a state that never had death penalty, if you want an even more robust comparison. But here the results are mixed. Okay, some studies find large deterrence effect. Some studies find zero effects, and there are some studies that even find an increase in crime, no, due to death penalty. Now, there are a number of more recent articles showing that these studies are also very problematic from a statistical or econometrical point of view. There are some very technical problems that I should not mention now, like a low statistical power, but there are some intuitive reasons. For instance, a court decision to suspend death penalty is probably not really independent from other things going on in the society. Okay, so maybe this happened in periods when citizens show or are more concerned about crime, or maybe when the political environment is different in that state during that period. And you know, all the things could be related to crime being higher or lower. So we may be capturing other things, other underlying things, and not really the effect of death penalty, right? So in our study, this is an ongoing study with my co-author, Jordi Blanes i Vidal from the LSE. We recognize that, okay, we may never be able to answer this very general question about deterrence because of all these statistical problems. So we focus on a slightly different question that we feel that we can study empirically with more confidence. Okay, so we say, why don't we look at what happened with serious crimes in the few days or few weeks following an execution? But don't look at what happened in the entire country. Let's look at what happened in the counties or the cities where the execution is likely to be an important event, where people will talk about it. So specifically, we look at the county where the capital crime related to that execution was committed. No, and this is the county where usually the family of the victim live. Usually local newspapers give a lot of attention to it. So likely criminals will get this information about the executions. No, sometimes there is an execution that is related to a county in Texas, but it is not even mentioned, or it is only briefly mentioned in the New York Times or the Washington Post. So we don't expect that criminals in other parts of the country, like New York or Washington, react that much to an execution. And this is essentially what we study in the paper. So we look at about 500 executions in the period 1997 to 2015 in the United States. And we find that when there is an execution, and in the county related to this execution, so where the capital crime was committed, there is a reduction in the number of serious crimes. This is if you compare with other counties in the US or even within the same state. But we also find that this effect lasts very few days, like 4 or 5 days maximum, and then this lower crime rate dissipates, right? So our interpretation of this result is that executions may act like a reminder for criminals. So they may be more alert or conscious about their actions or the consequences of their actions for a few days, but then they go back to normality very quick. So this is a behavioral effect, okay, where having very vivid in your mind the potential consequences of crime can affect your behavior, but this is a very temporary mental state. So this is essentially the main idea of our study, and these are the general background and how our study differ from previous papers in this area.
Okay, thank you for explaining it. So you haven't yet talked about the significance of your impact. What were the results of your findings? So did they show that executions do reduce crimes in the area that they're made?
Okay, so the reduction in crime that we find is significant. Let's say it's statistically significant. I think that in our sample, the average number of serious crimes in a day typically is 0.5 crimes, and we find a reduction of about 0.1 crimes in the first 2 or 3 days after an execution. However, this effect lasts very few days, as I mentioned before, and then it disappears. So from an aggregated perspective, every execution has a very small effect. So in this sense, our results imply that executions are somewhat ineffective from a policy perspective. Now, something I should highlight here is that our study can't answer some questions. For instance, what would happen if we eliminate death penalty in the long run, or if we introduce death penalty in a new state? We can only answer statistically what happened with crime relative to a short window of time, let's say 1 month or 2 months.
Okay. I think you mentioned this already, but how important is, that the executions be put in the media, like in newspapers and TV, for it to have a significant impact?
Okay, so according to our interpretation about this finding, this must be an information shock. So we would expect that executions that receive more media attention in the States are associated to a larger reduction in crime. And just because criminals are more likely to get this information shock, this kind of reminder. This is what we find. Executions with high media coverage in the state are associated to a larger reduction in crime. this like 75% higher effect compared to the average effect of an executions. And executions with very low media tension have very small effects.
Okay. And then, is there any effect of local executions on neighboring states and counties?
Yeah, so we do find that the county where the capital crime was committed is the most affected. But if you look at counties at the radio of 50 kilometers, you see a similar effect, this reduction in crime that lasts very few days, but the magnitude of the effect is smaller, like half of the main effect that we find for the county where the capital crime was committed. And if you look at counties at 70 or 100 kilometers away, the reduction in crime is like 1/4 of the main effect. So the effect dissipates fast as you move away from the relevant county, probably because executions are not big information events there.
And then my last question that's very specific to your findings is, how does the rate of executions affect the impact? Because if executions are, like a rare event, then psychologically it would, you might think you have more of a chance of getting away with crime, but if they were more regular, does that have impact?
So another prediction of our interpretation is that executions are more important shocks when they are rare events, as you mentioned. So in counties where executions are very frequent, an additional execution is not really a big event. It does not surprise anyone. So criminals should behave more or less the same before and after this event. And we do find that crime is affected mainly when executions are not very common in the county or when the last execution occurred years ago.
Okay. And then what most surprised you about what you found? Was there anything that you weren't expecting?
Well, at the beginning, we were surprised by how quick the effect disappears. It took us some time to interpret these findings. We even had to write a model to explain this behavior, because the traditional models of criminal behavior don't predict this. In those models, you would expect that information updates have some effect on crime, but this effect should be more permanent, at least until a new update arrives. But you won't expect that you have this initial shock and that this shock disappears very, very quick. I would say that we were also surprised about the low coverage that many executions receive in big newspapers. Sometimes they briefly mention it on page 25. Sometimes they don't even cover it, and we are studying a period between 1997 and 2015. So this effect was also more important when you go back to the 90s, where internet was not very spread, where people were not very used to look at news in social media, etc.
Okay. So this is a bit of a wider question, but so do your findings support a pro-execution or against execution view?
Well, I think that our study does not try to answer that question, because in order to look at what happened in a short window of time, that is what we do in our study, we need to statistically remove any effect that the existence of death penalty may have in the long run or for the entire state that we are looking at. So in other words, in our study, death penalty always exists in the background, but sometimes an execution occurs and we study what happened in the few days following that execution. But we can't see what would happen if, for instance, we remove death penalty forever in this county, or if we introduce death penalty for the first time in a state, and then we can't look at what happened in the long run. So we can only show a partial effect, no? Which is a well-estimated causal effect. That is the problem that we were trying to solve compared to the previous literature. And we are confident that we are not capturing other stuff going on at the same time, which is one of the main issues of the previous studies. Now, is this partial effect that we estimate high enough to support executions as an effective policy to deter crime? The answer, I believe, is no, because this is a very local and short-lasting effect.
Okay. And overall, what was the response like to your paper? Was there any like critique or compliments on the way you went about your findings?
Well, we haven't presented this. This is still an ongoing paper, so we have been presented this paper in different like seminars and workshops. We have received a good reception, mainly because we have presented this paper in academic environments where people were more worried about the statistical content of the paper, or how well executed is the empirical design, and maybe there are people doesn't discuss much about the political implications of the findings. But overall, we have received good comments about that part. We try not to explore much the political or the personal opinions about death penalty in this academic environment, just because we focus on the technical part of the paper. That is what we are interested in showing at the end of the day.
Okay. And what other aspects need to be considered in the politics of execution? So I think that's everything you tried to cut out from your research.
Okay, that's actually not an easy question. So beyond the limitations that we have to measure if there exists any deterrence effect in the long run, as I mentioned before, we also need to think about the cost of this policy. And this is not an easy task. It's not easy to measure this cost, and this also requires an extensive empirical discussion. We should also think about what happened maybe to a society when you introduce this policy. A concern that some academics have is that other values like tolerance or trust in the community may be affected. And unfortunately, we don't have a good answer to this yet. So we haven't estimated very well all the cost of death penalty, particularly in the long run. Not only monetary cost, I'm talking about general cost for the society, because it can distort other things like trust or tolerance, so we still don't know that part yet. And regarding the deterrence effect, we are still debating about it. So there are many things that we need to consider. And finally, but I think not less important, there are arguments in favor and against death penalty that are moral in nature. And I think that the political debate should talk about this. We should be very skeptical and scientific when evaluating the empirical effect of death penalty, but it doesn't mean that we should ignore moral considerations when making a policy decision. Okay, but we need to do this knowing the facts, the cost and the benefits of a policy.
Okay, and this is my last question. Overall, do countries with executions have lower crime rates?
Actually, it's the opposite. What you find in the data is that counties with executions have a significantly higher crime rate. However, remember that these counties are probably different in many other dimensions. So we can't just assign this difference to death penalty. We would like to see this same countess in a parallel universe without death penalty, but with the same other characteristics. Okay, but this is, of course, what we can't do, and would introduce all these problems that I told you before about estimating the effect of death penalty. And actually, this observation that counties with execution have a higher crime rate, or state with execution have a higher crime rate, push some academics to propose a theory called brutalization. The hypothesis is that it could happen that in the long run, death penalty reduce the value or the respect for life in the society. So people don't care much about the consequences of crime. The society becomes more violent, crime increases, etc.
Okay. Well, those were all the questions I had. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to me.
Okay, thanks a lot for your invitation. It was a pleasure to talk about our study.
Okay. I will send you the links to everything once I publish them.
Okay, thanks a lot. And yeah, I will be really interested in knowing about actually other interviews. I took a look at the website. I found like really cool interviews and even some topics that I didn't know much about, and you can really learn about that. So yeah, congratulations again. This is a great initiative.
Thank you so much. And
Okay, you're very welcome.
here's a quick recap. So we learned a really interesting method on determining the short-term impact executions have, as well as things that affect the impact, like the rate of executions, media, and area over which the impact is felt. I would like to hear your thoughts on this. If you have any additional information or thoughts on the topic, please leave it in the comment down below. And as usual, thank you for watching.